I'm so excited today. Do you know why? Do you know why? Okay, because we're at church, that's right. And we are also going to be talking about one of my favorite people in the Bible. We're going to be talking about David today. If you want to turn with us, we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 24. Before we get there, while you're getting there, let me explain to you where we're at. For those of you just joining us, we are in a series called Boxing Gloves, Running Shoes, and Work Boots. And this is a series about how do we deal with conflict and how do we deal with hurt, how do we deal with jealousy, how do we deal with all of the things that we might be in conflict with other people. These three things, the boxing gloves, running shoes, and work boots, are three different ways we tend to handle things. Our boxing gloves is that tit for tat, you hurt me, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, I'm going to hurt you back. And that's our first response. Anytime somebody says something to us or does something to us, we're going to hit them right back with the same thing they hit us with. That's not how we're supposed to handle it according to the Bible. Secondly, we have our running shoes approach. This is the second one that we tend to turn to. If I can't get along with you, I'm just going to disappear. I'm going to stay away from you. I'm not going to talk to you. I'm going to avoid you at all costs. But here's what we found out about our running shoes approach. Running shoes always take you right back in a circle, and you'll end up back at boxing gloves probably sooner rather than later. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to figure out how to take our work boots approach to conflict. Work boots being that hard, nitty-gritty work that we have to do to love people, to serve them, to pray for them, to pay them back with kindness when people have mistreated us or when we have a disagreement. And it's really hard to do, and I want to look at a story of David and how he was able to do this. Up to this point, we have been very boxing glove centered. We have been at the center of understanding how not to respond in kind to someone, to treat them exactly as they treated us. And we focused a lot on work boots because that's our goal. But you know what we haven't looked at is we have not yet looked at somebody with the story of our running shoes, avoiding conflict, getting away from it, and not ever handling it. The problem with that is you never ever get to an end of conflict if you just run away from it all the time. Well, I want to look at the story of David and how he was handling a conflict using his running shoes and what God did to him. Let me give you a little bit of background before we get into his scripture. Going way back in the story, Israel had always been a nation of people ruled by a theocracy. You guys know what a theocracy is? That's a government ran by God. It's a religious government. They had never had to have a king or a president or a governor or a prime minister or any of those things. But they looked at all the nations around them and they started saying, everybody else has a king. We want one too. And God come to them and said, no, you don't. You don't want a king. And they said, yes, God, everybody else has a king. And God said, no. You don't want a king. You've got me. I tell you what to do. I take care of you. I am your God. You don't need a king when you've got God as your leader. But these Israelites, if we know anything about them from the Old Testament, they were stubborn. And they said, no, God, we want a king. And so God says, okay, it's not going to work out very well for you, but I will honor your request and give you a king. The first king that the first king that God chose was a man named Saul. He had a prophet named Samuel. That's who the book is named after. Samuel went to Saul and he anointed him and he picked him. And Samuel told all the people of Israel, said, this is the king that God has chosen for you. And the story of Saul starts out pretty easily. Saul, he's a good king. He tries to do the right thing, but Saul messed up. God told Saul to attack a city and to get rid of everybody in there, and he said to kill everything that was in that city. It doesn't matter how good the goats were or the cows or any of that stuff. God said kill it. And Saul said, yes, Lord, with you I can do anything. And Saul goes in and he takes over the city, and it's just as easy as it can be. And then he looks at all the goods that are there, all the things that could be used, all of the good goats and all of the cattle, and he says, boy, it's a shame if we just killed them and let them rot. Maybe we should take them back with us. And he disobeyed God. God was very displeased with Saul, and he come to Samuel and told Samuel, so go tell Saul, and this is the message that Samuel had for Saul. God has rejected you as king. He made you king, and now you are rejected as king. And that very moment, God called Samuel. He said, go find another king. And he sent him, and he found a little shepherd boy named Daniel to be the king. Now, we've got a problem at this point. We have two people that have been anointed to be king. But Daniel, he's anointed. He's not kingly at all. He's just a little shepherd boy. Saul continues to be king for years and years and years after this. At least 30 years, Saul is going to continue to be the king after God had picked David. But David and Saul, their paths cross. They actually become friends. And then we have the story that we all know of David and, say it with me, Goliath. And David goes out there and everybody is scared to face Goliath, and David goes out there with nothing but a slingshot and takes down the giant. And of course that makes David a hero immediately. And this is where it all changes. Saul is riding back. He's had this great victory out on the battlefield. He's riding back into town, and this is what everybody is singing. Saul has killed his thousands. And you can just see Saul riding his horse. People see him and he hears that and he's going, "That's right. I'm King Saul. I'm the man." Ladies, do any of your husbands ever do that when you compliment them and get a little big-headed? Maybe that's just me. I do that. But anyway, Saul's going, "I'm the man. These people love me. I won the war. I'm awesome. I'm great." But then he hears the second part of the song. And the second part of the song literally changes history. They said, "Saul has killed his thousands." Saul head explodes, so happy, so proud. And then here's the second part. It said this, "But David has killed 10,000s. And now all of a sudden Saul's looking at, "You're talking about the boy? You're saying the boy is greater than me?" And something starts in Saul's heart. He starts to become very, very jealous of David. And this gets to the point of jealousy where Saul and David have this really complicated relationship where they're really close, and then Saul will randomly try to kill David. And so now we have this story where David is running away from Saul, running in fear of his life. And that's where we're at in 1 Samuel chapter 24. That was a lot of explaining to get us to this point. We're going to read verses 1 through 15. It's going to explain to us where David is. Saul is trying to kill David. David is running from Saul. And this is what happens. Verse 1. "And it came to pass when Saul was returned from following the Philistines that it was told him, saying, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. And Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of Israel and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. And he came by the sheepcotes by the way, and there was a cave. And Saul went in to cover his feet, and David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. And the men of David said unto him, Behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, Behold, I will deliver thy enemy into thine hand, and thou may doest to him as it shall seem good unto thee. And David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily. And it came to pass afterward that David's heart smote him, because he had cut off Saul's skirt. And he said unto him, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So David stayed his servants with these words, and suffered them not to rise against Saul. But Saul rose up and out of the cave and went on his way. David also arose afterwards and went out of the cave and cried after Saul, saying, My lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped to his face with the earth and bowed himself. And David said to Saul, Wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, Behold, David seeketh thy hurt? Behold, this day thine eyes have seen how the Lord had delivered thee today in my hand in the cave, and some bade me kill thee. But mine eyes spared thee, and I said, I will not put forth mine hand against the Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see the skirt of thy robe in my hand, for in that I cut off the skirt of thy robe and killed thee not. Know thou and see that there is neither evil nor transgression in my hand, and I have not sinned against thee. Yet thou huntest my soul to take it. The Lord judge between me and thee, and the Lord avenge me of thee, but mine hand shall not be upon thee. As saith the proverb of the ancients, Wickedness proceedeth out from the wicked, but mine hand shall not be upon thee. After whom is the king of Israel come out, and whom dost thou pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea. Verse 15. The Lord therefore be judge, and judge between me and thee, and see and plead my case, and deliver me out of thine hand. So David is running, and he's hiding in a cave. And I want to tell you a little bit about this area of En-gedi that it talks about. This is a very, very remote region. It's very rocky, and that's why it talks about the wild goats that run up and down the rocks. It's very mountainous, and it's full of caves. And David has in his heart, I've got to find somewhere where I will never be close to Saul again, where Saul can't find me, Saul can't see me. Anybody that knows Saul can't find me, and even anybody that's ever heard of Saul will never, ever know where I'm at. And so he goes into this very remote region, and he takes the 600 men that are with him, and they hide in the cave. Perfect. Saul will never find me in a cave in a very remote region. But God had a different plan. Point number one, if you take notes, if you're keeping up with points, is we need to be willing to recognize a divine appointment. David's in this cave, and he's thinking, I've got it down. I can live in this cave forever. This cave, it said that it was a sheep cote, and what that means is this cave was large enough that shepherds at nighttime would drive huge herds of sheep in here, and this is where they would stay at night, that they could protect the mouth of the cave, and all the sheep could stay in there. This is where David is at. David is in there with himself and 600 men, and when Saul walks into the cave, Saul doesn't know they're in there. That's how big this cave is. And David's sitting there thinking, I've got this down. Nothing's going to happen. Saul will never find me. And then who walks into the cave but Saul, the last person he ever wants to see? I've got something to tell you. This was God doing this. This was a divine appointment. See, David had on his running shoes. He was running from his conflict. He wasn't going to address it. He was just trying to stay away from someone who might hurt him. But God had a different plan. He said, if you're going to hide from Saul, I'll bring Saul to you. So let me tell you about Saul. Saul has been out on the warpath. He's been out with his soldiers, and somebody comes to him and says, hey, we heard David is hiding somewhere out in this wilderness. And Saul says, let's go get him. Saul, who is maybe just a little bit too excited, takes 3,000 men with him. They're riding through this region. They're looking for David. They're looking for his men or some sign of a camp. And at the exact moment that Saul passed the cave David was hiding in, he halted the column and he said, excuse me, I need to go in this cave. And the Bible says, cover my feet. Other translations say, attend to my needs. And I'm just going to say it this way. He needed to go to the bathroom, okay? And so he walks into this cave, halts this huge thing, and at that exact moment, he had that exact need. He walked into that exact cave. You will never convince me that God didn't have this planned out from the beginning. Saul walks in, and not only does he walk into the cave to check it out, as king of Israel, he's about to have some private time. You guys know what I'm saying? You go to the bathroom. You don't want a bunch of people around you. And that's what he said. He said, no guards. You guys stay out here. I just need to go in there, and I need some private space. And so not only does Saul walk into David's cave, he walks into David's cave not knowing David was in there. He walks into David's cave without anybody to protect him. And Saul is in a position of vulnerability, I guess is the best way to put it. That is God's hand on it. And David is sitting here, and he's going, really, God? You're going to bring him to me this way? Now, I've got a question for you guys. Has this ever happened to you? I would call this a divine appointment, where you're trying to avoid someone and you don't want to be around them, and who do you bump into first thing? Like, if I go to Walmart at midnight, so-and-so will never be there, and who is the only other person in Walmart? I'm not saying this is going to happen to me or you this weekend, or this week. I'm saying it may happen to me or you because God may have a plan. And I want us to be prepared for a divine appointment. If God is really truly working on your heart and my heart about the conflict we have in our life, about the people that maybe we don't get along with, I think He's going to give us opportunities to fix that conflict, just like He did David. So some of you are thinking, well, I'm not going anywhere this week. I'm staying locked in the house if this is what God's going to do. But I want us to be prepared for this divine appointment. Let me ask you a question. You're David. You're hiding in a cave. 600 strong warriors. And the man who is trying to murder you walks in unguarded and unaware that you're there. What do? Everybody knows what you would do. I'm going to take this opportunity to save my life. I'm going to take this opportunity to slay Saul. But David didn't do that. David walked up there and cut off a piece of his robe and snuck back into the back of the cave. And I want to look at this, what David had to deal with, because you and I would have thought, this is our opportunity to kill Saul. And we probably would have even thought, God has given us our opportunity to kill Saul. If you look at David's warriors, this is what they say to him. They said, David, it's Saul, and he's by himself. This is that thing that God promised you, that one day Saul would fall into your hand and you could do anything you wanted to him. Go kill him, David. And this is what is funny about that. Nowhere in the Bible does God promise David that Saul is going to fall into his hand. It's not in there. It was made up. It was an opportunity that looked like it came from God for David to kill Saul. And even his soldiers said, David, this is it. God promised you this. But it wasn't. Now, this is a side point. This isn't a point that is the main point of the sermon. This is a side point. If we're going to be serious about handling our conflict the way that God wants us to, we cannot surround ourselves with cheerleaders. And what do I mean by cheerleaders? We cannot surround ourselves with people who are going to tell us that it's God's will for us to treat people in a way that we shouldn't treat people. We're not going to surround ourselves with people who say it's okay for you to disrespect your boss at work because they're incompetent. We're not going to surround ourselves with people that says it's okay for you to treat them that way because they deserve that. And that's what David had. He had a group of men around him that said, David, it's okay for you to kill him because he deserves it. We got to be careful of surrounding ourselves with those cheerleaders, because if they do, we will miss the point of a divine appointment. Now, if you read into the story and you see what happened between David and Saul, it's very clear here that God had a plan, but it wasn't for David to kill Saul. God will never give you a divine appointment so that you can hurt someone else. God will give you a divine appointment so that you can resolve conflict and love someone who is unlovable. Let's continue to look at the story here. Point number 2, I've got a question for you guys. If you're me, or if me and you are in the cave and we're David, and we're sitting there and we got our sword and all of our strong men, and here comes Saul. Everybody, when I asked that question, nobody answered it, but everybody smiled. I'm killing Saul is what we all thought. Bad Christians. Okay, that's what everybody in this room thought. What kept David from doing it? What was it about David that he didn't see it that way? Even with the voices of 600 men around him telling him, this is God's plan for you to kill Saul. What kept David from doing this? Point number 2. David sees Saul through God's eyes. I'm going to say that again. David saw Saul through God's eyes. About 3 weeks ago in our grace-colored glasses sermon, I said this to you. I said, if you view yourself as a victim and whoever has hurt you as the villain, you will never be able to love them. That is true today. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to take it a little bit deeper with this point. If we name people by their actions, you will never be able to love them. You will never be able to put on your work boots, and you will never be able to do what God has called us to do as Christians when we're in conflict. It's that simple. We've got to adjust how we see people. David looked at Saul, and David could have looked at Saul and saw so many things. He could have saw Saul as an enemy, because he was. He could have saw Saul as an unworthy king. He was. Even God had said, Saul, you're unworthy of being king. He could have saw Saul as a murderer, because he was. He could have saw Saul as a manipulative father-in-law. He could have saw Saul as a friend who betrayed him. And in any of those cases, if that's what he saw when Saul walked in, this is an evil man, and it's easy to take retribution. It's easy to pull out those boxing gloves. It would have been easy to kill Saul. But that's not what David saw when he saw Saul. It's getting hard. That's not what David saw. If you want to know what David saw, I think it's in verse 6, but I know it's in verse 10 as well. This is what he says when he walks out of the cave. Saul has left. He's let him get away. David's in the back of the cave holding his men back, saying, no, you can't kill him. And he walks out and he explains himself. He calls Saul by only one name, and it's not unworthy. It's not murderer. It's not the friend who betrayed me. He calls him the Lord's anointed. This is all that he saw when he saw Saul. This is the king of Israel until God changes it. Now I want you to look at the heart of David here. David was out in the fields when the prophet, not a prophet, not a preacher, not somebody who was kind of godly, the prophet of Israel come to him, pulled him out of the fields, poured oil on his head and said, you're the next king of Israel. David had claim to the title of king of Israel as much as Saul did, maybe even more. But in David's heart, when he looked at Saul, he said, I see the man who was anointed the exact same way that I was anointed. I see the man who was chosen by God the exact same way I was chosen by God. And I trust God that I will be king one day. But until God removes Saul, Saul is the king. That's what he saw. He looked at Saul through God's eyes and he said, you know what? If this is the man that God has chosen, I'm not going to touch him. I'm not going to attack him. Very often we have a problem remembering who God says people are. We label them by their actions. We label them by what they've done to us. We label them by the hurt that we felt, but we don't look at them through the eyes of God. Let me tell you all a story. I lived in Jonesboro, and one of my buddies came home, and we lived in these apartments, and we all had our own apartments, but we just walked into everybody's other apartment all the time. He walked in, and he was going off about this. I think it was a lady that he worked with. He was going off about her, and he was so upset, and at the time I thought this was hilarious. This is what he said. He said, "I'm not saying I hate this woman, but if she was on fire and I had a glass of water, I'd drink it." I thought that was so funny at the time. Now, just let me say, that's not the right thing to feel, but that's what he said. But I can tell you why he thought that. First off, I don't think he would have truly did that. But anyway, but he was making a point that this person is unworthy of even my simplest act of kindness because of whatever they did or didn't do to him that day. I don't remember what it was. That's what he said. And Christians, he was a Christian. I was too, probably not very good ones. But how often do we look at people like that? Your actions make you unworthy of my simplest act of kindness. Your actions make you unworthy of my love or my service. But David didn't see it that way. See, David saw what I hope that we all see. Every person that you come in contact with, regardless of how bad they hurt you, regardless of what they did to you, regardless of how bad the situation is, every single person that you and I will ever see is a person made in the holy and perfect image of God. And we cannot assign value to people and think that we have that right. We might be sitting there and thinking if that person was on fire and I had a glass of water, I would drink it. Because they're not worthy of my love. They're not even worthy of my little old glass of water. They're not worthy of me serving them in any way. But this is what Jesus says about that very same person. He says, I think they're to die for. I think they're worthy of every last breath that I'll give up for them. And it doesn't matter what they did to you or what they did to me. See, Jesus died for me, and he died for you, and he rose again so that we could be saved, and we could go to heaven, we could escape our sin and be free from it. But he also did that for that person that keeps popping into your mind every time we get on this sermon series. You guys know who I'm talking about. Who's your Saul? Who's that person that comes into your mind and, oh, they hurt me. It might have been 30 years ago. Or even worse, oh, they hurt my kids. Oh, they did something unforgivable. That's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, I can forgive them, just like he forgave me. And if you're here and you're a Christian and you're a follower of Jesus Christ, he forgave you. And we cannot be followers of that very same Jesus Christ when he says that they are worth his blood, they are worth his life, if we sit around and we decide their worthiness of love or their worthiness of forgiveness. We don't get to decide people's value. That decision was made on the cross, regardless of how they've acted in the meantime. David saw Saul through God's eyes. And then I want you to look at how David reacted. Point number 3 is David reached out. Now Saul leaves, and David could have just stayed hidden. Whew. He's gone. Him and his army of 3,000 people can't find us in here. They have no clue we're in here. They definitely won't look in here after the king has done his business. They're not coming in here. He could have stayed in there, but the Bible says that his heart was troubled, that he was so guilty that he had even disrespected King Saul enough to cut off a corner of his robe, that he goes running out of the cave, yelling like a madman. Can you imagine that army of 3,000 people sitting out there? Here comes the king. He's been in the cave, taking care of his needs. He comes out, and we got to go find David. And here comes David running out of that same thing. Oh, king! Oh, my Lord! How confused would you be if you were in that army? If you were in that military unit? Well, that was easy. Here's the guy we've come out here to kill, and here he is. But look at David. Look at how he handled his divine appointment. David reached out to Saul. He came out of the cave first, and he talked to Saul first. And if we end up in one of these divine appointments, I'm locking my doors and staying home after preaching this. If we end up in one of these divine appointments where we run into that person or they call us or whatever it is that we bump into them, and God's given us the opportunity to make it right, I think this is what God calls us to do. We might put it in good old Southern speak, be the bigger person. Reach out first. Say hi first. Start the conversation. Say, Brian, I'm running from them. So was David running from Saul, but he started the conversation. He reached out to Saul, and he came out because of his eyes. And David said this. David even said, you know what? Compared to what you've done to me, you've been trying to kill me. There's a story where Saul throws a spear at David and just barely misses him. David is living in a cave. And even with all of that, David says to Saul, I'm in the wrong. I should have never disrespected you enough to cut off a corner of your robe. Now, me and you, we might weigh that. The trying to murder someone versus cutting off a corner of the robe. I think David showed great restraint. But David comes out and he says, Saul, I should have never disrespected you this way. And why? Because you are God's anointed. And sinning against you is sinning against God. And treating you unkindly or unfairness is treating God unkindly and with unfairness. And then, I love this. He doesn't just come out and say, Saul, I'm sorry, and throw the corner of the robe at him and take off back into the cave. David comes out by himself. 3,001 people trying to kill him. And he bows. He puts himself in a place of vulnerability. See, God brought Saul in a place of vulnerability before David, so David could be in a place of vulnerability before Saul. This man wants to kill me. And David lets down all of his guard. David has no thought for self-preservation. He comes out and he shows Saul honor and love and respect. And he bows down and he says, my king. See, David could have died in that instant if people weren't so shocked. He comes out there, 3,000 people, dumbfounded. What keeps us from treating people with the kindness that God calls us to, with putting on our work boots, is that very same fear of vulnerability. David had to have been terrified. He's human just like me and you. He was scared to death to come out there. This could have been the last little bit of David's life. And he chose to live it in such a way that God had called him to. Because he was willing to be vulnerable, because God's calling was more important to him than his own personal safety. You want to know why we pull out the boxing gloves when somebody hurts us? Because we're scared of being vulnerable. I want you to know that you can't treat me this way and get away with it. You want to know why we put on our running shoes and hide in caves with the goats and the sheep? Because we don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to be close to you. You can't hurt us if we're away from you. But I'm going to tell you right now, if we're going to heal from the conflict that God is trying to get us to heal from, if we're going to move away from treating people the way they need to be treated, or the way we think they need to be treated, it's going to come with a degree of vulnerability. David runs out of the cave and explains to Saul what he did. He's vulnerable. He could be killed. He could be hurt. He could be arrested. At the very least, he could be made fun of. And he could have stayed hidden. But here's what David had going for him in this moment of vulnerability. He said, my God is greater than my vulnerability. If you look at verse 15, this is what he said. He said, Saul, you can do whatever, but I trust God can deliver me from this moment. And as Christians, that's where we need to be, is that if God gives us a divine appointment, if God gives us an opportunity to love someone and treat them with kindness, someone who doesn't deserve it, if God gives us the opportunity to be vulnerable before someone, we can walk into that with the assurance that God has got us. God is not going to let us fail at this. And it doesn't mean that there is no risk to this. It doesn't mean that somebody might not hurt us again. It doesn't mean that this might be or might not be difficult for us, but we can trust God with our conflict and be vulnerable before those who have hurt us, as long as our heart is in following God. See, Saul had value regardless of his actions. I want you to look at, if you've still got your Bibles open, verses 16 and 17. After this huge speech that David gives, he comes out and he's vulnerable before Saul, and he says, I see that you are the Lord's anointed, and I should have never disrespected you in any way. I'm not trying to hurt you. I don't want to fight you. I want you to look at what Saul said. 16 and 17. And it came to pass, when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, that Saul said, Is this thy voice, my son of David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. King of Israel, backed by 3,000 mighty warriors, he sees David and he sees this reaching out and this respect and this love, and he breaks down crying in front of all of his men. And he said unto David, Thou art more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded thee evil. You see, this particular conflict that could have ended up with Saul killed, it could have ended up with David killed, it could have ended up with a battle between the army of 3,000 and David's army of 600. It ended with peace because David was willing to follow God's directions more so than he was willing to give in to his fear of being vulnerable before his enemy. Because he was willing to love and see people with grace instead of see them as an enemy. There's a pattern coming out in these stories. That God takes care of it. That there is this pattern of peace when we do it God's way. Because see, when God's people trust in God, they put on their work boots, the impossible can literally happen. Can I have the musicians, please? I want to ask you this morning about this message. Are you in a place where you could bump into your Saul at Walmart tonight or at work tomorrow or wherever it is that you're going this week? That person who comes to your mind every time you step in this church and we have this series. Are you at a place where you could treat them with a love and kindness and a respect the way that David treated Saul?